masonry. We don't want anybody to get hurt. And we're in the rose garden area, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But Mattie has a poem that she's going to read, and this poem is, you may not know it, but this is a spiritualist poem also. Do you want to go ahead and...
Talk about don't?
What's that?
Is it don't that I'm reading?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. A reading from our Sunday Talks by J.J. Owen, entitled, Don't. Don't be selfish or mean or narrow-minded if you can help it. Don't consider it your duty to be a common carrier for any sort of scandal. Don't trifle with those you love nor tread on the heart of a friend. Don't meddle with other people's business. Don't think evil of anyone, even of those you do not like. The world is wide enough for all. Leave them alone. Don't try to pull down those above you, but always seek to lift those beneath you up to your level. Don't make yourself disagreeable to anyone simply because you know how. Don't yield servile submission to tobacco, whiskey, or any other debasing habit, but have manhood and womanhood enough to be decent and wholesome and masters of your own bodies. Don't be contented with emptiness of heart or brain, but cultivate the gentle amenities of life and store your mind with useful knowledge. Don't be suspicious of others who are just as good as you are, and perhaps a little better. Don't be a fool. The end.
Yay. All right. Yeah, hopefully there'll be some poetry that will surprise you that it came from this time period. Anyway, where's Anita? Hey there. Where is she? Alrighty. Okay, great. Well, oh, let's see. I think I have some filler bad poetry I can read. This is from Josephine Gibson, was a bar owner that was buried here, and her bar, like a lot of them, had fresh oysters, and this is a poem that they ran in the newspaper. Oysters, oysters, fresh oysters, all prime, to be served in quick time, either roasted or fried, stewed, pickled, or pied, as gentlemen wish who call for a dish. Whigs, Democrats, know-nothings, and all, please give us a call. Was that one of the bad ones? Mother's name was also Esther. Was born in Ohio but raised and educated in Sacramento, going on to Mills College. And then as she was a debutante, she spent the next several years traveling Europe, Mexico, Asia, and the Hawaiian Islands. And Esther married Charles Edward Darling, known as Ned Darling, in 1907. Ned was an Irish immigrant who came to Sacramento, where he was associated with the Whittier and Fuller Paint Company. And in 1900, there was a big gold rush in Alaska, and he went up there, and he must have been successful because the papers referred to him as a miner. If you were unsuccessful, you're just a bum. So they got married, and they moved to Alaska and stayed there till 1917, after which they would summer in Alaska and winter in Berkeley. And they loved Alaska. Most of her writing is about Alaska and Alaskan dogs, racing dogs in particular. She co-owned a dog team with Scotty Allen, which twice won the All-Alaska Sweepstakes, a rugged course of 408 miles. One year they won it in 80 hours, the next year was 87. So that sounds like an intense ride there. She published her first book, a chapbook of poetry, up in Alaska in 1914. And this is a poem. It's illustrated, too. It's at the State Library and at the Sacramento Room at the Public Library in Central Public Library downtown, which, if you aren't aware of it, you should all go there. They have a fabulous collection of Sacramento-specific historical stuff that you can't find elsewhere. And this is her poem called My Pup-Mobile. I've ridden on a camel where the tall and stately palm stands sentry to the desert's burning sand. used a gondola in Venice and a rickshaw in Japan, breasted breakers on Hawaii's coral strand. I have traveled on a burro through the mountains of New Spain, sailed the tropic seas upon an even keel. But for sport, give me Alaska with its white and silent trails, and a spin behind my racing pupmobile. She wrote a bunch of books, probably 6 or 8 books that were, I would say, young adult books about racing dogs, and some of them were from the dog's perspective, like Call of the Wild. Baldy of Nome was one of them, and that's this here. And it seems like they're all based on her real-life dogs. And she wrote for newspapers like Sunset and Outdoor Life, and the Sacramento, San Francisco, and Nome, Alaska papers, mostly about Alaska life and dogs and racing and stuff. Many of her books, her fiction books, contain references to her and her real-life husband and her dog sled team co-owner. And this is from her book, Navarre of the North. Navarre is the dog. And Baldy is another dog. And it says, "Oh, Baldy's above smiling. Why, I seen Mrs. Darling once trying to make him carry her purse," the dog. "And the look he gave her was enough to make even a woman feel ashamed. I said, plain as words, 'See here, lady, I ain't no light-minded lap dog. You just lay off this foolishness.' He was plumb disgusted. I'll bet she never told Scotty about it. They say in Nome she's clean ruined Jack McMillan with her petting." That must be another dog. "And they used to call him a man-eater." Moose glanced cautiously towards the kitchen where Mrs. Barrow was preparing dinner. "Son, no disrespect to women, but don't you ever let them mix with your dog team. They don't seem to have no dog sense whatsoever." She was also the only woman president of the Nome Kennel Club. 28 dogs from this club were sent to France during World War I and served with the transportation division of the Alpine Chasseurs. I don't know if I pronounced that right or not, but they actually a pretty badass team that were, if you had to go climb the Alps, that's the guys you want to talk to if you want to go do that. Anyway, and she, of course, wrote about that little chat book called "For the Glory and Honor of France." And this is an excerpt from that deals with that here. Let's see. A wolf dog lying on a white grave in faraway Nome. A dog with whip lashes that had brought blood but not fear. That had crumpled in a crimson pool across the line. A winter that crept alone into the Arctic waste for help. That stood on the Defiance with the waters of the Bering Sea widening. A dog who had come to fight for France. Yes, that was it. That was what he wanted to tell the general. And about a mailed fist with loyalty unto death beneath it. Meant you'd fight for your country or a friend until you died. And that was what he and Navarre and the pups of Jeanne d'Arc had been trying to do. And she lived to be about 100 years old, actually. She was publishing books. I think her last one came out when she was in her late 80s. And this is the final climax of the book. And I'll let you figure out what's happening here. It doesn't really matter. Jean, you here? How did you come? Why? His hands clutched hers desperately. His burning eyes met her steady, tender gaze. I came, Peter, because her grasp tightened on the thin fingers in hers, because I found I could not live without you. Oh, my darling, he murmured. As he spoke, there was a harsh grinding and a mighty crash, a reverberation like the thunder of artillery, then the sound of free and flowing waters, the ice breaking in Alaska. Peter raised himself on his elbow, listening intently and looking out into the brilliant blue of the Arctic April sky. "Break up, Jean," he cried. "The ice is going out. It's spring in Alaska." "The ice has gone out, dearest." Her lips met his. Spring indeed, Peter. The end. All right. On background of Amy.
Okay,
Amy,
sure.
I mean, you probably know as much as anybody else.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. Edwin and Margaret Crocker were local philanthropists. They were very wealthy. They started the Crocker Art Gallery, as you probably all know, and they had several children, but most of them died as young children. One who grew to adulthood and became notorious was their daughter, Amy. She married 5 times. As she got older, her husbands got younger. The last one, she was in her 60s, he was in his 20s. She had tattoos. She owned a pet snake that slept in her bed. And all of this was in the 1800s when women just didn't act like that. She traveled all around the world. She had lovers, male and female. She was very infamous for her behavior. And she was also a writer of sorts. So, I am going to read today an abridged version of The Painted Mrs. Perry by Amy Crocker. He was 20. She was 35. There was 15 years difference between them, and a great deal more. Gordon was simple, even for 20. Mrs. Perry was complex, even for 35. He didn't know anything. She knew everything. They were both good-looking. He was good-looking, and he looked good. She was good-looking, and she looked bad. He had a healthy face and a wholesome manner. She had an unhealthy face and an unwholesome manner. He was absolutely natural. She was absolutely artificial. Until Gordon met Mrs. Perry, he had only known girls, schoolgirls. He had never known a woman of the world. Gordon had a man friend. The man friend had a woman friend. The woman friend was Mrs. Perry. Gordon was at a cafe with a man. The woman was there with another man. Gordon and the woman were introduced. They came, they saw, and they conquered. He conquered her, and she conquered him. He had never seen anything quite so wonderful as this woman. She fascinated him, and she had never seen anything quite so wonderful as this boy. He fascinated her. She invited him to call on her. He accepted the invitation, and he called. Mrs. Perry lived in her own house. Gordon was ushered into the drawing room. Mrs. Perry was dressed in black. On her face was a quantity of makeup. Her cheeks were painted white, her lids were painted blue, and her lips were painted red. Her hair was dyed the color of burnished copper and was worn in a weirdly wonderful way. Mrs. Perry looked at Gordon. Gordon looked at Mrs. Perry. She smiled. He blushed. "You are so good looking," she said. Gordon blushed. "And so am I," said Mrs. Perry. Gordon stammered. "Don't you think I am?" said Mrs. Perry. "Of course I do," said Gordon. "Don't go further," said Mrs. Perry, "but come nearer." He came nearer. "That's a good boy," said Mrs. Perry. "A very good boy." "Do you object to my smoking?" said Mrs. Perry. "Not at all," said Gordon. "Since you have been obliging enough to let me have a cigarette," said Mrs. Perry, "I will be obliging enough to let you have a kiss." He looked amazed. She looked amused. He hesitated. She held up her face. He kissed her. "And now we are friends," said Mrs. Perry, "but we must be more intimate friends yet. We must know one another better, much better, very much better." She blew a puff of smoke into his face. "You must tell me all about yourself," said Mrs. Perry. And he did, under her clever manipulation. "And I must tell you all about myself," said Mrs. Perry. But she did not, again under her clever manipulation. When Gordon got up to go, the clock was chiming 12 o'clock at night. And when Gordon finally did go, the clock was chiming 3 o'clock in the morning. Mrs. Perry asked Gordon to come again, and he did. The next night, and the next, and the next. He came every night for 2 weeks. At the end of the 2 weeks, while they were smoking cigarettes and sipping absinthe, Mrs. Perry said, "Gordon, you must never come to see me again." "What do you mean?" said Gordon. "I mean that you are a boy with a future," said Mrs. Perry, "and I am a woman with a past. You have a life before you. I have a life behind me. We are not equally matched." "We are," said Gordon. "We can't be friends," said Mrs. Perry. "But why? Why?" said Gordon. "Because you are a dear, sweet boy," said Mrs. Perry, "and because I have got a painted face." "I love you," said Gordon. "I have got a painted face," said Mrs. Perry. "I love you," said Gordon. "Do you love me in spite of my painted face?" whispered Mrs. Perry. "No, I love you on account of it," whispered Gordon. And it was so, and she knew it. The surprise was that he knew it. But Gordon had learned a lot in 2 weeks.